So, hi, Jack. Good morning. It's nice to see you today.
Yeah, it's very nice to see you. It's been too long not being at a cafe together.
That's right. That's right. So, Jack, as I explained for NYU Skirball, we're doing this series on paradigm shifters because we are clearly going through some major upheavals in how we think about the world, how we live in the world. And we think this conversation is a way to invite people who themselves have shifted paradigms and are continuing to do so, especially for other people to see how that works, what is the work involved, and how to make it stick, how to make it last. And if I can start out, so I've known you in your capacity as a professor of history, the inaugural director of the Asia Pacific American Institute at NYU, as I've, of course, known that you've been the co-founder of the Museum of Chinese in America, and now you're a professor of and the Clement A. Price Chair of Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University in Newark. If I can start out with something that I have always found really important is your idea of the Dialogic Museum, which is an article that's become a reference for a lot of people. And maybe we can start there with the Dialogic Museum, your work for the Chinatown History Project, and then go in any direction you want to go.
Yeah, well, that was written a while ago. It was written really when I wasn't in the university. I wasn't an academic. I wasn't a professor. It was really in a context in which I was going to school part-time while I was working in Chinatown. And we had started what was called the New York Chinatown History Project at the time. And having left graduate school, I was at the University of Wisconsin, East Asian Studies, history. I left graduate school because I really didn't want to pursue book learning, but on its own terms, and strictly developing a PhD project from that.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt I needed to immerse myself in, answering the question for myself, really, where's home? And even though my background is not Cantonese in terms of that part of China, it's a province west of there, but I've never been there. I felt that for Chinese in America and many Asians in this country, Chinatown was a place to go to. And it was a place that was closer to an actual residential community with a vibrant culture and a vibrant life. So out of that process, I helped to set up the New York Chinatown History Project. And it really was a process of learning by doing. So John Dewey has always been very resonant for me, learning by doing, learning that Chinatown, even though at that time was becoming rapidly the largest in North America, one of the largest communities outside of Asia, that the question of who's an expert and who knows what and how that knowledge circulates became central. And really, I just felt that outside of the bounds of the bubble of learning in universities, it was just an eye-opening experience for me to realize that, even just passing the dumpsters that were starting to show up in Chinatown in the 1880s. Excuse me, this is my time warp. Okay, I'm always thinking 18, 17, whatever, 1980s. Okay, and what had happened is that we got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I had no PhD. I was not a professor. We got a grant, and dumpsters started appearing around Chatham Square. Chatham Square is a historic square downtown. Most people don't know its history. Very important. It turns out to be right in the heart of Chinatown. And these dumpsters started appearing because there were stores that had 99-year leases, and those leases were ending, and people were just dumping stuff into these big dumpsters that were from Olaf's Pharmacy, the oldest existing pharmacy on the Bowery from 100 years before. And there's this moment of tremendous real estate transition in which stores that had always been there, as far as the residents were concerned, were basically shutting down, and they were not valued whatsoever. And as a historian, this drove me crazy. So I began just going into these dumpsters, salvaging the stuff. It wasn't strictly all Chinese, but it became clear that this was a multi-ethnic, multicultural neighborhood that has never really been acknowledged as such. It had always been seen as one group or another: Jewish, Greek, Chinese. And there was no understanding that this is a much more complex place in which, in fact, from my point of view, this was New York. This is New York, the crucible of the city, in which that intermingling adjacent to the ports really happened, and that the culture, the popular culture, emerges from these very streets as well. So I began understanding that the history is really in the streets, in the landscape, in the buildings. It's being tossed out all the time. It's not being valued all the time. And it's embodied in the stories of people who are living in the community. So this is a time in which the new social history, the so-called new social history, was emerging, and people are looking for all these alternative sources. You look at the census material, you look at the police records, you look at artifacts of everyday life. But the problem is that those archives were predefined. Whatever was collected and whatever was extant was what people went to. But in fact, I realized in this setting that I needed to go into the communities in which these histories were enacted and lived, and the buildings still had those stories and the people still had those stories. So the idea of a dialogue and learning from who? Learning from the people who are living in these places, and the experiences are still embedded there. That became a process of really thinking about rethinking the question of expertise and who's informing who.
Can you say something about, when you said there's a kind of new social history, but essentially you stepped out of academia for a moment and you realized there's expertise held elsewhere. How did you access that part of information and in one of the articles you've written, it says the Dialogic Museum is public discussion of a truth that has either been forgotten or deliberately suppressed. This was maybe a truth that was just being thrown out because people were losing their buildings or moving or something like that. So the expertise is in the community. How did you access it as still coming from probably more of an academic background than a lot of these people working and living there, right?
Absolutely. There are many answers to this, but I'll just focus on the work we did with Chinese laundry workers, which was the focus of our one of our grants. It was the 10,000 plus Chinese Chinese hand laundries that were in the metro region. The 5 boroughs, the surrounding area. Newark had a very large Chinatown early on. The 10,000 Chinese laundry workers who, well, actually I should say 10,000 Chinese hand laundries, which had more than, of course, one laundry worker per laundry. So we're talking about scores of thousands, of tens of thousands, in which they were the ones who actually built the Chinatowns. So the question of, oh, is it the merchants who had the money and had the stores, the usual kind of logic of how a commercial district emerges? No, actually, it was these laundry workers and the restaurant workers who were scattered throughout the city. And why were they doing this work? Well, it's because of the Chinese exclusion laws. And most Americans don't know that history. They barely know the history of Jim Crow, but the history of Chinese exclusion during the period of Jim Crow was critical.
So this is the time period, give our listeners or viewers. So what years are we talking about you're addressing here?
Well, technically, the exclusion law was from 1882 to 1943 when it was repealed, and it was when China was fighting on the so-called side of the US against the Japanese invasion of China and throughout many parts of Asia. Therefore, it was too embarrassing to continue to exclude Chinese since they were now an ally against the war against the fascists and Japanese imperial aggression.
There's
But
60 years of racial exclusion
yeah,
while Chinese people are living in America and are Americans also, right?
yeah,
So you're sort of excavating a history, and you said two things, and I think this is important, that, and I've learned this really from you, that I can't remember that the Chinese Exclusion Act was ever mentioned to me in college or graduate school, which may be really on me because surely it was mentioned and I didn't hear it, but not hearing it is also, I actually was probably taught not to hear it.
yes.
So you're trying to show and to go to these laundry workers and the people who lived in these communities. So what did you start doing? Did you start interviewing them or asking them what their lives were about? Like, how did this knowledge come into this process?
Yeah, so the one thing, the graduate school, but also the new social history movement and the politics of the time. I mean, I come out of the anti-war movement, and it became clear that the stories of everyday people, the stories of people who are being bombed, for example, you know, are important. The stories of the grunt soldier who's on the front line and really had no choice to be there. Those were the stories that we began focusing more and more on. So how do we get at these Chinese laundry stories? Well, I was not the one to do that. I was the one who could then write the grant proposal because I was trained in, even though I left graduate school, I knew how to write uh, well enough to get a grant and to write proposals. It's a certain kind of skill. It's a very peculiar kind of skill that requires a engagement with a system and a language and a jargon. So I could do that. And we began bringing together people who spoke the right dialect, because we're not talking about just anybody can access people who are coming out of that laundry experience. There's a very particular set of dialects. Oftentimes the village dialect from across the river would be a slightly different village dialect than the one. So we are talking about multiple sets of people who could work as a team. So again, that's also very different than the individualistic kind of model of how you pursue knowledge and how you pursue an individual PhD to become a professor. So by working as a team with people coming from different backgrounds and different skills, we were able to do this work together. So that's always been a defining moment for me in terms of how to pursue the co-production of knowledge. It's of course co-producing it with the laundry workers and the laundry families, and understanding their stories and helping them, in some cases, shut down the stores that their families had been working in for decades and decades.
Right.
How that, but it's also the co-production of knowledge with a range of people who have different skills, and that's where it's all very important to have folks who come out of a Cantonese experience and are able to both speak a rural dialect or communicate people who are primarily of a rural dialect, but also know how to do production work, let's say radio programs. So we began collecting these stories and began reworking them in ways that could be then presented back to these very same communities in ways that would be really honoring them, but also asking them, so do we have it right? Is this correct? Does this speak some truth to your experience? And then they would say, no, you have it all wrong. Or they would say, well, this is great, but then you don't know about this thing, right? So it becomes an engaged dialogic research project in which we're really co-producing the storytelling with the understanding that we need to understand this within our community, because this is a community going through rapid changes. I should say, just to finish the story about Chinese exclusion, well, in 43, the quota then that got set, which defaulted to the 1924 eugenics immigration laws, became 105 Chinese per year. Now, that's not exactly repealing exclusion. That law did not get repealed until 65, 68. So the reason why all these stores were turning over, and the reason why Chinatown was emerging for the first time since this long dark period, this long winter of exclusion, was that the 65, 68 laws were finally enabling Chinese to return back into New York City in a way that they could begin to expand Chinatown. So these stores were turning over in Chinese restaurants that we now think of today as being typical of around Chatham Square, East Broadway, the Bowery, Mott Street, those streets. That was where these 99-year leases had been. So, so it's really kind of being aware of that historical context that people are living in, but oftentimes these new immigrants who are arriving don't know that story. And so our goal was actually to create also a dialogue between the new arrival immigrants and the older immigrants who had survived and had to endure this period of exclusion.
So I
Yeah.
want to stay for one moment with this, that the space, first the New York Chinatown History Project, it becomes a Museum of Chinese in America later. This is a space where the community continues to have participation and say, this is actually the truth of this story. So to phrase this a little bit too bluntly, but you were not going in writing a proposal saying, oh, we've overlooked the history of Chinese in America. People don't know this, the way I just said in my college days, I wasn't taught certain things. So your goal was not, let's correct the mainstream history of America to insert this footnote and give it a little bit more detail. You were saying, I'm going to create something else where the truth is not located in this dominant history that now needs more footnotes for other people or from the ground up, but actually to shift where the authority or the truth-giving authority lies. Right. You're saying that is located in the museum. So you're not building a supplement to the big museums of the history of New York and sort of, oh, and then you can just also do an afternoon at the one for Chinese. So this is so what you were doing is two parts, not just, I want to put this history in front of everybody, but keep the community at the center. Right. That they can shape how their histories, many, many different histories, as you're saying, are seen.
Yeah, it's really a question of the authority. Who has the authority to actually tell that nuanced and much more truthful history in the context that really embodies the human experience, the complexity of the human experience. So it is a shift, a major shift of how museums and historical societies work, but it's also a direct challenge to the academic production of knowledge as well.
All of this right here, like all the book now, right? But that's actually what I'm interested in. Where you were coming out of this world where you sound like you made a decision because history teaching maybe, or the production of history was not acknowledging that there's a truth in the lived experience of people.
Right, right.
Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and that in terms of the history of racial segregation, racial obliviousness, scientific racism, the legacy of dispossession. I mean, it's to put this in the larger context, the dispossession of Native peoples, the enslavement of African Americans in the region of Chinatown, in the region of the Lower East Side, in the region of the port culture, and that the China trade, and then the people who came over as a consequence of the China trade and began to emerge in the port cities and towns along the Northeast coast, these were the first Chinese and Asians to arrive, but it was in the context of what had happened before. So that what I began to realize is that, well, the book learning actually has some value. I don't know what's behind you are of any value, but they provide an opening context in which people's lives could be actually understood. I think something that's irresponsible is if we work with communities, publish a book, and then that book sits on one of those shelves and has nothing to do with those communities. Again, they don't see anything of it. Somehow there's this attitude that, well, when their young people get on to college, that's when they have a chance to read this stuff. Well, no, that's the wrong way of thinking about this. You have to build institutions and organizations and spaces, you have to build archives that become a place of ongoing engagement, a place in which people can feel that they don't have to throw away that stuff, but that they can donate it, and that their children can go back into a collection, actually see that material and see what their grandfather had done in a way that was respectful and honoring that life, right? So there need to be these infrastructures in which we can build not just archives, but stories
Yeah.
and also narratives that are really counter to the mainstream, simplistic, naive notion that the Dutch purchased New York,
Right. Yeah.
which is so dominant, right?
Well, when you just said it connected to larger stories, the enslavement of Africans who become African Americans, the treatment of the indigenous native populations, that actually Manhattan was owned by people, the Lenape Nation. Did you realize this connection when you started your project, let's say 1980? I mean, we never know all what we know at some point, but when did you start realizing this is a longer, deeper story? Because I assume your initial interest was, okay, I got to document and give a voice to this community in a way that isn't just, as you said, becoming a footnote or put on a shelf in a book. But when did you become aware that there's another context, which is a lot of your work over the last decades has really been this larger context?
Yeah, well, it's evident in Chinatown. It's evident in the Lower East Side. So it became very clear to me that Chinatown was never strictly Chinatown, and that there was this deep multiracial colonial history that even these stores that had 99-year leases were a part of, and that we tend to think of the Lower East Side as multi-ethnic, as immigrants from Europe and succession, groups, and therefore we have Little Italy and the Jewish Lower East Side and Gus's Pickles and all that kind of notion of what the history is, right? But in fact, those very same streets were deeply intermingled and intertwined, in which each group that was arriving, each group that had been here, were interacting with the new groups arriving. And that a new kind of culture was emerging that was at once brutal, exclusive, treating, kind of formulated by the settler colonists, treating the people who they were encountering or who didn't fall within their norms as others, right? So that if you're Dutch Protestants and you're encountering indigenous Lenape peoples who are not agreeing with a trade deal you want to enact with them, all of a sudden they become an obstacle to your expansionist desires. And as an obstacle, then you want to claim that they don't have the same rights to the land as you imagine your lawyers telling you that you do, right? So that's the pattern of the city. And to this day, we actually have a fantasy notion of what the history of the city is. New Yorkers actually don't know what the history of the city is. And we, as the migrants living in the city, have to know and have to encounter and have to grapple with what had happened during the colonial period. So we're talking about layers and facets and dimensions in which the past is always living in the present. And the challenge of living in the present is to be sensitive enough to know where we can begin to see these threads that are still there. So just to be concrete, Lower East Side, it's always had an African-American community there. And that African-American community goes back to the beginning of the formation of New York City. And that the very first Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Latin, Afro-Portuguese settlers were really put onto the Bowery as a buffer zone between the wall of Wall Street erected by African enslaved labor and the indigenous people who were still outside of that wall, living throughout the region. And African Americans get put right in the middle of that, right? So we've always got a relational set of stories that have been reduced to, oh, this is the story of the Italians. This is the story of the Jews of New York. This is the story of the women of New York. This is the story of the prostitution history of New York, right? It was all together in that same area. And it was my goal then to both acknowledge that there was a Chinese part of this that was tied to the China trade, tied to the Orientalism of the time, of the European aristocracy. Why was General George Washington so obsessed with the Chinaware that he was going to have on his table, even in the midst of the battle, right? What was that about, right? So this more complex political culture, which has always existed in the Lower East Side and in the Chinatown area, but we don't know it.
But you were walking around and seeing things, and you are kind of saying, well, if you're a sentient being, you just get it. But a lot of people are not getting it, and because I think they either invested in another narrative or they're told that they would benefit from that investment. They may not even benefit, or they may not even know it's a narrative. They just think, well, it's Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, is for a lot of students, a lot of people, the introduction to the Lower East Side. There's a couple chapters devoted to each ethnic group. The ones on the Chinaman are really offensive and unbelievable, but they actually shape, I think, in spite of all of his intentions, they shape the understanding. But I'm interested in, you're walking around there saying, this is obvious, this needs to be done, but not everybody probably is agreeing with you and saying, yes, absolutely, this is the history that we need to have, which is a more nuanced history. And I wonder why people don't just embrace it and say, yeah, that's just a more nuanced history, a more correct history of how we become who we are today.
Yeah, well, I think it's typical of New Yorkers, for example, when they develop a pattern in this very complex, crazy city, they follow that pattern, and they tend to want to move through the spaces of the city so efficiently that it doesn't get in the way of their pattern, right? I mean, so in some ways that's a classic kind of New York brusqueness, about everyday life and the New York minute kind of idea. But I think there are lots of neighborhoods who retain these memories and stories. Mm-hmm. and it's in the built fabric, it's in the letter that somebody finds hidden in a floorboard in the apartment they live in. I think we're all aware that we're living in different times in any one place. I mean, this is true for any historical place, right? But since the United States is so ahistorical and kind of new, relatively speaking, it's places like New York where you get this sense that you're living in an apartment building that other people have lived in, and that you have to honor that, right?
Yeah.
And so that sense of multiple time places as you're walking from building to building, as you're going from downtown Wall Street to Chinatown, it forces people, if you're taking the time to walk, and this is like a walking meditation question, okay? If you're taking the time to walk and think about the buildings and notice things around you, it's kind of like walking around in nature and trying to be present as you're walking through a forest or on the water and looking at birds. It's the same thing in the city. And I think if we slow down, actually notice and pay attention and ask the questions, then that becomes a matrix in which we can research. That's what I encourage everybody to do, but also students especially who are arriving into New York. They want to kind of claim a connection to the city, and they can actually, through courses and through this engaged teaching approach, they can be an expert about something, but it has to be very focused and it has to be very clear. So, for example, one of my students noticed as they were walking by the Manhattan Bridge that there was this tree stump that was cut off, but growing straight out of the side of the bridge, right? So that became a question, that became a focus of research. And they did a fantastic research job on that, right? That then helps to understand, well, when did the bridge get put up? When did that part of the bridge get, that facade, so that that tree was cut down, all these kinds of things. So being in the city and being in any place is really a process of really asking questions and trying to see the layers and multiple facets of a story. So that's, I think, really the source of my wonder. And I think it goes back to the fact that I come out of a refugee immigrant family, and I was the first one born in this country, and we ended up in the middle of the prairies of outside of Chicago. And I had no clue why we were there because basically my mother would speak to me in Chinese and talk to me about China. and going back to China. And so why were we there? And what was this place? I mean, you know, for people born there and they think they belong there, it's not a big deal. But for me, it just didn't make any sense. So I think that sense of wonder and surprise and also looking at things comes out of that kind of experience, which is true for a lot of people who migrate into a place. Right?
And in order to respond to this, as you've said, you've set up institutions and created places and spaces for communities to meet, to engage, to keep on revising even whatever has been found and instituted there in a museum or in a collection or something. So you've always felt that it wasn't just enough to know this, to notice this, to create a new archive and then to transmit it. You felt always it has to stay open in a way. Can you say something how that relates? And your idea of the Dialogic Museum, I think, has informed a lot of historical societies and collections. But we still have big museums where there's very little, where community engagement means you do a public lecture. You do an outward-facing event, that's it. The public comes in and visits and maybe pays or doesn't pay, but that's it. But you're talking about actually co-creation with communities, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically it goes back to this notion that of participatory democracy, and that I think there's a lot of formality about how our nation is democratic, but it's also a patina. It's also just a thin little layer on top of things that actually are quite top down and quite authoritarian in terms of, oh, no, this is the authoritative history of this area. We know better, right? And a lot of that goes back to not that long ago, in which a certain perspective, largely white male, largely Protestant, was dominant in the institutions that produced books.
Right.
And so that perspective, not always acknowledged in terms of that subject position, but that kind of perspective has so deeply infused the notion of what counts as history, how to do a proper organization of a historical society, whose voices and whose diaries and whose stories are more important. So we're talking about hierarchies and structures which reinforce each other. And certainly during the period of Jim Crow, scientific racism, where people were measuring, you know, brains and foreheads and, you know, all sorts of things, saying, well, these people are closer to apes and we're more highly evolved. And then it culminates with eugenics, which is still an ongoing powerful force in US society and European society that has never really been fully acknowledged. So these kinds of ways of sorting and hierarchying are deeply infused in a lot of the basic assumptions of contemporary scholarship, of the modern day university, the separation of disciplines, the assumption that somehow the Enlightenment is the basis in which we're all contributing to, and modernity is something we're all contributing to. And it's not understanding the fundamental flaw of those sets of assumptions, in which Enlightenment was also twinned with colonialism and imperialism. Right?
I want to underscore one thing you just said twice, that there was scientific racism. And I think it's quite important that it's not pseudo-scientific racism. That was the accepted science of the day. I listened to Nell Painter, who wrote The History of White People. She said the other day, yeah, that was the science at Yale, Princeton, and Harvard. This was science. And today we'd like to think ourselves a little bit more sophisticated and say, oh, that's pseudoscience back then. And what you're saying, that was the dominant way of organizing knowledge and people. And that today we can look at it and say, we find issue with it. I think I also heard you say about your project about eugenics. We haven't quite really resolved how we've moved on from this. And now we know this is the wrong science, and now we have the right science, because it used to be actually the people who decided what's right are still the same people. So how do you get this history into it and undo these hierarchies, so these structures where knowledge is really held and organized and transmitted?
Yeah, well, it does go back to greatly diversifying and challenging the foundational assumptions of the institutions that are there, both in terms of historical museums, historical societies, museums in general, the whole classification systems and the whole organizations of curators on top, educators, kind of towards the bottom. The educators deal with the public. They're the ones who know the public the best, but it's somehow a supply side. Well, the
Right.
public is coming in the door. They don't know anything. The educators supply them with the information as the curators, who are the ones who are trained and on top of the museum hierarchy. And then the administrators raise the money and, you know, do the galas. It doesn't work that way. It's actually the people coming into the door who oftentimes have more critical perspectives and ways of understanding what's there. So there's actually a dialogue that's constantly going on in all these spaces, including the universities, that is unacknowledged. So that someone like Fred Moten and Stefan Harney will talk about the undercommons. Well, it's this fugitive Black space in which learning is happening anyhow in these spaces, in the universities, in the historical societies, despite the intentions of the people who are running those places, right?
Right.
Fugitive spaces, they're still forming study groups, they're still learning a lot, but
Yeah.
it's not organized in any intended way. There's also the idea of the third university, in which indigenous students are kind of entering into these institutions that are not at all designed to support their understanding of their own cultures and histories and languages. But they will do it anyhow, so it becomes a constant hacking process. Every day is a hack. So how do we hack these institutions? That's one thing. But also, why do we have to go through all this energy? Why can't we just create institutions that actually are more directly responsive to the democratic possibilities of, you know, what Langston Hughes would talk about as the America that never was, but the America that must be, right? So how can we grapple with those paradoxes in which we're never really in the ideal situation that we need to be? We need to kind of constantly work towards creating more of those spaces and ways of thinking, and not just shut down, not just leave, right? So how do we do that? Right? That becomes the challenge.
I'm going to ask you a question I asked of Deb Willis. How have you dealt with people who are just not so enthusiastic about this idea to undo these hierarchies, to rewrite some stories, and to give up on narratives that they are invested in for whatever reason? And because probably not everybody thinks, yes, let's create spaces that are not hierarchical in that way, because it's very comfortable once you reach a certain position, I'm sure, to sort of say like, this is actually, and secondly, a lot of people have been acculturated into this through histories of compliance or whatever, and then they feel this is the structure I'm comfortable with because it gives me order and stability. What you're proposing is so disordered. What does it mean that a museum visitor would know more about the painting or the sculpture or the artifact or the book? So how did you, like you said, you were a good grant writer in the beginning, and you have a funny anecdote. Brooke Astor, I guess, said like, he's a nice young man, I have no idea what he's talking about, but we'll give him the money. So how do you actually, as an individual, how do you deal with people who are not totally enthusiastic about this?
Well, it's deciding where you want to pick your battles. How do you want to spend your time? You know, I generally will not spend a lot of time engaging with those folks because I want to do something more positive. I don't want to just sit there and engage in an Oxford style debate with them. I mean, you know, why bother really? At the same time, so I think hacking and working around bureaucracies, particularly entrenched individuals who can only think one way, and they've been thinking that one way for their entire 50 years of their professional life, you know, it's only worth so much time. You know, now we don't always have the choice.
Yep.
We're oftentimes stuck in situations, and then we have to be very thoughtful and strategic and still figure out how to make a living, you know, in those situations. So I'm not diminishing those realities, but when you have a chance to work around them and to create something that actually then would change the context, that's what I've tried to do. So, you know, it depends. It's always a question of strategy and tactics, and being true and honest and genuine, but not looking for conflict every place that you go, because that only gets us so far, right? So I think for me, it's understanding the pain that and the violence and the difficulty, and you know, the word trauma is used a lot now. I think there are degrees of violence and degrees of
Mhm.
difficulty. So I tend to not use it so lightly,
Yeah.
but there's plenty of that that we're constantly dealing with, and there's plenty of anger. And there are plenty of people, including a lot of the white males who feel they've been bypassed in terms of their scholarship, and they're not being honored and they're not being respected for what they had done, you know. But that framework, that kind of tradition of top-down authority um, is something that is not suited to participatory democracy
Yeah.
and kind of culture that we are creating now. So, you know, not just in universities, not just in New York City, but when we get new people coming in who actually speak different languages, have different historical backgrounds, have different normative expectations of what it means to be male, what it means to be female, what it means to be gendered in multiple ways, what does it mean to be multilingual, what does it mean to be living in the past and the future at the same time. You know, all of these kinds of more complex realities that the kind of rather still conventional Calvinist, Puritanist
Yeah.
culture of the U.S. Um, it only improves and opens up the culture. And the most obvious example is food, right? I mean, if we just stuck with the traditional English food that had arrived, you know, and was considered the height of the quality, well, it's, you know, we'd be missing so much, right? So once you get new people coming in, new perspectives, this is what I mean by the museums and the students that are arriving at our institutions. We tend not to respect them. We tend to think that they're there because of us, that we know already, and that they're blank slates that we need to then inculcate to them what the sophisticated, nuanced ways of thinking and understanding should be. It doesn't work that way. They oftentimes have incredible insights. Yeah, there's a lot of skills that they want to get and they know what they want to learn.
Right. Right.
But we're just really so um, so rigid in the way we understand engagement and teaching and collaboration.
Well, and I think part of what your work does, and it's done this for me, Jack, is really sort of to actually also point out the assumptions we have that are unconscious or not acknowledged. So in some ways, I remember you saying this to me, I'm probably getting it a little bit wrong, but it's been a very powerful moment. You said America was settled in a way, or like there was an indigenous population and people arrived from the East Coast and from the West Coast. And the story that is sort of in your mind is like, you know, there's Plymouth and there's 1619, Virginia, Jamestown. There's like this kind of, there's this, you know, people arriving from Europe. And you said, no. There are people arriving from Asia. And that's the same history. And for me, that really shifted away. And I thought, oh, I'd never even really kind of questioned that. I know they were indigenous people, and then people arrived from Europe. And that's kind of from Columbus to Jamestown, something like that. And you said, no. And that, for me, was obviously understanding of the institute you founded at New York University, the Asia Pacific American Institute, which you also taught me, said, it's a complicated name. It has hyphens or dashes in it. Okay,
Flashes, yeah.
deal with it. And I was in a position, you know, to work with you in this, and I said, well, what? There's a slash, there's a this. You said that is exactly the point. Is Asia Pacific American, and we're not putting hyphens in. We're not using one word. So and I think part of it is to point out to people they are invested in things they don't even know they're invested in because they take them for granted. But I wanted to take this to saying there's been this opening to sort of think about America is people coming from all sorts of places and in different kind of waves, and not just one story. Your current work focuses also on the indigenous populations, on climate change, and I want to at least reference the two things: the Yellow Peril book and the exhibit you did, which was documenting anti-Asian sentiment for at least 100 years, I think. It's an archive of anti-Asian fear. And you did a show on the eugenics office. Maybe you can touch upon those things that I think are all sort of actualizations of this idea of a dialogic participatory scholarship.
Yeah, well, you know, one gets pigeonholed very quickly in all sorts of circles, right? So I became the guy who knows about Chinatown, right? So, And part of what I've been wanting to do is, and people, that means that people have never really visited or worked, or read my work, or actually visited the exhibit, because the work is always about opening it up, not about closing it down, not about some narrow formulation of identity formation, but in fact, always opening up these questions that our lives are intermingled and complex, and always shifting depending on historical circumstances and the choices we make, right? So for me, it's been a play between the dominant political culture of this place and of this time, that then can be, traced back to a certain kind of rigid, very aesthetic, Calvinist Protestantism, in which music and dance and singing was deeply repressed. Okay, and that all others who arrived, whether they're Irish or Jewish or Spanish, well, they were Catholics, right? So they're already outside the boundaries of what's acceptable, proper behavior, right? But it's also the linkage between this virulent kind of commercial culture that gets linked with Calvinism, this very strict, disciplined kind of aesthetic, which really explodes into a certain form of capitalism, right? That expands in powerful ways all around the world. The most powerful form, I would argue, would be Anglo-American kind of settler colonialism, which explodes and creates all sorts of others that are automatically deemed inferior in various kinds of ways, including their own women, including their own children, right? So the hierarchies and fractions are kind of played out, a cosmology, which we can see in museums, in the traditional 19th century museum, and how that gets played out, how gendered roles, how various kinds of others are ranked in order and treated as if they really are not human, really. So the distinction between a natural history museum and who appears in the natural history museum versus the museums of history and high culture and art, right? We can just see it played out to this day, right? So those kinds of segmentations are ones that we need to be constantly challenging and dismantling and unlearning, even while we can have them in front of us to understand how they exist, right? So if we can understand the multiple time places of each of these sites, then we can begin to unlock the power of them. And so for my different kinds of interventions, whether it's a book on the archive of Yellow Peril, and where the genealogy of that comes from, where it's gone, how it's morphed, or the way in which the Eugenics Record Office and the American Museum of Natural History and other institutions that began to emerge, why that Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History is deeply problematic, because it was really also an expression of that institution's notion of the races of mankind and the white Protestant male who could go into this world and actually bring about proper Protestant order to that world, right? So that whole worldview, which is in the museum, but also in that statue and the way that statue is designed, even though they're kind of realistically, portrayed, and they're not just gross racial stereotypes, so the ways in which those realities are embedded in our institutions and the very architecture and design of these buildings, we need to use every opportunity we can to look at one of those elements and one of those halls and one of those dioramas and begin to unpack it. We can do it anywhere we are.
I'm going to refer our viewers or listeners to another podcast that we did about the monuments, because you served on the New York City Mayor's Commission on Monuments. So if people are more interested in the Roosevelt statue, or you're thinking about that, because you're saying it's not just about tearing down something, it's about retelling a more correct history, that there's not one subject of knowing and the other people are the objects to be known. That's something else. So, and then to go to what you're doing, you're working now, you touched upon this earlier, and I'm really interested in this. You said the history of eugenics in a way is not over in this country, although in a way probably some people would like to think, well, that was in the 20s, that was wrong, that shows up in the opening pages of The Great Gatsby. and then it's dismissed. And you're saying you're working on a project actually to acknowledge the impact of that history still in the present, right? It's not just a historical show about the past or in the work.
Yeah, I mean, all these conversations are too long to be able to contain in our limited time, but yeah, I became interested in eugenics because I realized that there was a direct line and connection between the Chinese exclusion laws during the period of Jim Crow, during the period of uh, taking apart radical reconstruction, where there's a moment of possibility of making dramatic changes, kind of the earlier forerunner to the civil rights movement. So that the history of Chinese exclusion and yellow peril and fear of Asians is entwined with the fear of blacks that then get promoted in the early films and the popular culture, the popes of the time, you know, blackface minstrelsy, all those kinds of things are intertwined as everyday life. So eugenics really is a key moment in which a highly sophisticated, complex set of differentiations and measurements were kind of encoded into the culture. And the kind of the part that Americans have a hard time dealing with, especially liberals have a hard time dealing with, is that this was part of the progressive movement. Teddy Roosevelt was a fixture of the progressive movement, right? So that progressivism itself and the way in which government and social organization has become bureaucratized and organized with different experts who are trained out of universities to then go out into the communities and neighborhoods to then minister their expertise to improve the society, improve the organization of society. Well, part of that I believe in, it's really smart and good, but it was so unresolved in terms of the ingrained classist and racist and gendered perspectives that were never really fully addressed. So it's not just Trump, but when Hillary talks about the deplorables, you know, it's there. That unresolved question about hierarchy, expertise, knowing better what a college education means in terms of, oh, those people don't know shit, you know, they're ignorant, right? They're morons, right? The language of idiocy, morons, inferiority is the language of eugenics. Mm-hmm. It's the language of a scientific racism. It's embedded in our everyday culture. Mm-hmm. So it's living, it's alive and well. It's morphing into genomics. It's morphing into, I'm sure, as we discover who's getting vaccines and
of course
who to afford, the exotic antibody medicines that have come out of people who've been able to successfully fight off the current COVID-19, but we're talking about other kinds of diseases and crises as well that are going to be accelerating in the coming years with the increased impacts of. Right, this is where climate change is so important for us to also grapple with. It's making the worst of what we do, but also inviting the best of what we can do at the same time. We're kind of inviting the worst, most hateful, most fearful people to our dinner table at the same time that the most interesting, the most generous, the most giving people are arriving at it, and sometimes they're the same people, right? So, so it's all coming out at the same time, and it's going to be crazy, you know. So, in some ways, that urgency of unpacking, of decoding, of grappling, of coming to terms with, that is bubbling up so much with the Black Lives Matter movement, but also with indigenous efforts, those are critical for us to pay attention to, because we then can begin to open up the ways in which we've been pigeonholed and contained and limited in the same way, right? So this is a great moment for a new kind of reconstructive culture to emerge with the diversity and new awareness that we have amongst us. Right? So.
The things you just named, they are a little bit overwhelming, sort of think about them. But what you're saying is they're actually linked and they're actually interconnected, and to sort of isolate one and think, oh, we're going to solve this one. It's just not going to be solved, especially if we use the arsenal of methods we have available, which are probably part of the problem. So if we say we're going to engineer our way out of climate change and use science for that, or we're just going to vaccinate people and science is the answer to what's happened during this pandemic, that's just not going to respond to not just a few questions, but a few billion people on the planet are not going to be captured with the scientific solution. So what's going to happen? Yeah. Something is going to happen. So what would you say to, I don't think young people, what would you say to somebody right now if they're saying, okay, I'm kind of invested in all these things. There's so many things. And so I look at Tchen and he's studied all this. He's a historian. He is a founder of museums, of public places, of spaces, of archives. Like, how do you start out? What would you advise a person? And I never say a young person, like it could be someone who's, 80 years old right now and say, I want to start thinking about these things in a way that you're able, because you seem to be able to hold them in your mind and not get totally overwhelmed and can't do anything, which is inspiring.
Well, I mean, I'm comfortable in teaching courses where I'm actually not an expert in it, okay? Because I believe in the process. I believe in research. I believe in collaborating with students to explore something together. Mm-hmm. And I think more of us need to be willing to take that risk. In academia, it's unheard of. What? You're teaching a course about something you say you know nothing about, right? Who, what kind of idiot are you? What kind of moron are you? I mean, that's immediately the judgment comes down in that way. Well, I'm not going to have that battle with that person. It's not really worth my time. But if they were to actually be in that classroom with our students, even online, even in Zoom, I think they begin to see a process of critical unpacking, but also engaged learning. So it's not just the first university of experts and hyper specialists and specialists among specialists, but it's also people who are thinking critically about the formation of power and money into how we then understand the world and how disciplines get formed and which disciplines are taken more seriously. But it's also the third university of practice, of engagement, of how can you apply this to your own life? Even though you may not be Indigenous, how can you work with Indigenous peoples to support their work over a sustained period of time? That's not about who you are versus who they are, but it's about collaboration and building a different kind of way of knowing and a different way of creating institutions, right? So I think part of the thinking is that we're always creating the new possibilities while we're still entrenched in the old systems that we're necessarily in. And if there's any moment, this is a moment in which that's happening. So old notions of expertise and what skills are necessary to rebuild society and what is history for and it's not so much document the past and publish a lot of books and to get some kind of prestige that way. But it's really about the historical imagination and why the historical imagination is important for everyday people to engage with, right? And that in fact, everyday people have probably more historical imagination than many historians actually have. Right?
What do you mean by historical imagination?
Well, I think it's really becoming aware of time and place. And one's experience in relationship to time and place. So those who are moving and thoughtful and slowing down and cooking and working with local ingredients and trying to speak to the people that they're in a neighborhood with, even though it's a very different language. I think that those are the people who know about different time, places, simultaneous in one's life, right? So oftentimes we privilege the upper middle class traveler who can go from vacation spot to vacation spot, and that's what time luxury is all about. I'm not talking about those people, although they may have it. I'm talking about the migrants, the refugees, who actually have to survive in multiple places. They don't have the luxury of money becoming a cocoon in which they can live within and move within, or a bubble, right? But something where they have to just deal with everyday life and make some money enough to feed the family and get by. those are folks who are deeply, deeply aware of the difference between the place they came, the rural village they came from in Mexico, to being in Jersey City today. And they're actually kind of living these multiple time places every day, especially with their smartphones, right? They're able to kind of transit back and forth and try to make sense of what those things are, right? So they're curating that experience. They're actually living the experience of what Mikhail Bakhtin talked about in terms of chronotopes, chronos, time, topos, place, in which we are constantly constructing these hybrid time place experiences. And it's the learning of that skill. That's what, to me, research is about, is how can we refine the learning of that understanding? How can we curate that? How can we be a facilitator for that? So I see my role as being that, and offering spaces in which people can get support to do that.
No, I really, I like this description, and you're making it also clear. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not by becoming more aware how you're located in space and time, you're giving up something. You're actually deepening your sense of self. Part of that is also probably to undo some of the false narratives we've even been taught about ourselves. Because I think about the struggles in America right now, where we're thinking, who are we? What's our past? And there's a kind of competition set up. It's either this story or that story. And you're saying, there are many stories to be told. And they may conflict, they may be even incommensurate, but they exist. And in some ways, to deny one, it just turns your story into a false one.
You know, it's true. I absolutely am committed to that. At the same time, I want us to be honestly and seriously looking at how wealth and power and basically destroys public spaces and public culture, and is ultimately anti-democratic.
Yeah.
And so that I don't want to be naive about pluralism. The more pluralism, the better. I think there are real power, there are real stakes and struggles in this whole process, and we have to always be aware of them. And many of us are, of course, entangled in all that, right? And we have to become aware of how do we negotiate those ways and those entanglements in ways that we feel will keep our integrity and keep the spirit of what we're trying to do alive, right? So I feel that's in some ways the biggest challenge. And if we can instill that with our students, those are coping skills of the kind of crazy society that they're now living in, that may be quite different than the rural area they came from, or even the city they came from. So that is a different way of thinking about what the 21st century research university is about, but also 21st century institutions that can be about. And they're going to happen either way. So it's really not a matter of whether we let them happen. We decide they're going to happen, but they're already happening. And I think the question is more whether we're actually opening up the spaces for it to accelerate. And by accelerating it, by nurturing it, it actually means that we have a better chance of creating a different kind of culture and society. That's again, it's the America that never was, but the America that must be. Right now, I don't want to be just U.S. centric about America in that way, but there's a possibility in places where people come together and have a chance of peaceful engagement and dialogue, even though there may be lots of differences. Those are the crucible places in which something new can happen and must happen, right? Otherwise, we're dead. I mean, you know, the inability of us to deal with global warming right now is the denial, the hoping that there's going to be some magic hardware solution, that if we build enough barriers that keeps the oceans from coming in and flooding the shorelines, the thought that somehow there's going to be some magic all-purpose vaccine for every problem we have in our lives, and if we just buy enough through Amazon, then our whole world will be better, right? We know that's not true, and that the solutions are going to be more basic and more human. It's recently the United Nations international international panel on climate change, the IPCC, has been talking about the importance of indigenous local knowledge as part of the solution that we have to learn from, right? So that's the correct direction, right? So sometimes we need to go back into the deep past and understand the better, more sustainable relations to the land that are embedded in indigenous cultures and foodways and practices and ceremony. We need to take those things seriously and not treat them as somehow, oh, these are superstitious people who are not modern and therefore why should we learn from them, right? Which is still the dominant attitude. So how can we be humble enough to understand from the past and learn from the past as people who imagine ourselves to be so modern and sophisticated and advanced that what is there to learn, right? But I think we need to unlearn that too, right? So
I think we know that our sophistication comes at a staggering price right now. I think that's I think becoming clear. So I want to thank you, Jack, for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's actually really nice that you have some way to make sense of the kind of overwhelming part and break it down and say there are some ways forward, not one way probably, but to create these spaces. And I also want to just sort of tell the listeners and viewers to check out your websites and the things you've done that are publicly available. It's not just museum spaces, but also digital spaces where you're actually creating this kind of interactive space. I want to wish you all the best for the rest of this 2020, and let's hope that 2021, some people will enact some of the things that they're hearing from you today.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I hope everybody out there is managing safely and feeding themselves properly. And don't forget fresh ginger tea, lemon, honey, and maybe a little shot of rum or bourbon, whatever you have in the house is always a good thing. So
thank you. I'll try that today. Okay. Thank you so much. All right, it's great to see you, Jack. Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.